A lawn is an area of soil-covered land planted with grasses or other durable plants such as clover, which are maintained at a short height with a lawnmower and used for aesthetic and recreational purposes. Common characteristics of a lawn are that it is composed only of grass species, it is subject to weed and pest control, it is subject to practices aimed at maintaining its green color, and it is regularly mowed to ensure an acceptable length. Although these characteristics are not binding as a definition, lawns are used around houses, apartments, commercial buildings and offices. Many city parks also have large lawn areas. In recreational contexts, the specialized names turf, pitch, field or green may be used, depending on the sport and the continent. The term lawn, referring to a managed grass space, dates to no earlier than the 16th century, tied to suburban expansion and the creation of the household aesthetic. The lawn is an important aspect of the interaction between the natural environment and the constructed urban and suburban space. In many suburban areas, there are bylaws in place requiring houses to have lawns and requiring the proper maintenance of these lawns. In some jurisdictions where there are water shortages, local government authorities are encouraging alternatives to lawns to reduce water use. Etymology: lawn is a cognate of clan which is derived from the common Brittonic word land that originally means heath, barren land, or clearing. History. Origins: lawns may have originated as grassed enclosures within early medieval settlements used for communal grazing of livestock, as distinct from fields reserved for agriculture. The word lawn is first attested in 1540, and is likely related to the Celtic Brythonic word lan, clan, law, which has the meaning of enclosure, often in relation to a place of worship. Lawns became popular with the aristocracy in Northern Europe from the Middle Ages onward. The early lawns were not always distinguishable from pasture fields. It is speculated that the association between the word pasture and biblical mentions made lawns a cultural affinity for some. The damp climate of maritime Western Europe in the north made lawns possible to grow and manage. They were not a part of gardens in other regions and cultures of the world until contemporary influence. Before the invention of mowing machines in 1830, lawns were managed very differently. They were an element of wealthy estates and manor houses, and in some places were maintained by the labor-intensive methods of scything and shearing. In most situations, they were also pasture land maintained through grazing by sheep or other livestock. Areas of grass grazed regularly by rabbits, horses or sheep over a long period often form a very low, tight sward similar to a modern lawn. This was the original meaning of the word lawn, and the term can still be found in place names. Some forest areas where extensive grazing is practiced still have these semi-natural lawns. For example, in the New Forest, England, such grazed areas are common, and are known as lawns. For example, Balma lawn. Lawns similar to those of today first appeared in France and England in the 1700s when André Le Notre designed the gardens of Versailles that included a small area of grass called the tapis vert, or green carpet. The English lawn. It was not until the 17th and 18th century that the garden and the lawn became a place created first as walkways and social areas. They were made up of meadow plants, such as chamomile, a particular favorite. In the early 17th century, the Jacobean epoch of gardening began. During this period, the closely cut English lawn was born. By the end of this period, the English lawn was a symbol of status of the aristocracy and gentry. It showed that the owner could afford to keep land that was not being used for a building. or for food production. In the early 18th century, landscape gardening for the aristocracy entered a golden age. Under the direction of William Kent and Lancelot Capability Brown, they refined the English landscape garden style with the design of natural or romantic estate settings for wealthy Englishmen. Brown, remembered as England's greatest gardener, designed over 170 parks, many of which still endure. His influence was so great that the contributions to the English garden made by his predecessors Charles Bridgeman and William Kent are often overlooked. His work still endures at Croom Court, Blenheim Palace, Warwick Castle, Harewood House, Bowed House, Milton Abbey, in traces at Kew Gardens and many other locations. His style of smooth undulating lawns which ran seamlessly to the house and meadow clumps, belts and scattering of trees, and his serpentine lakes formed by invisibly damming small rivers, were a new style within the English landscape. Gardenless, a form of landscape gardening, which swept away almost all the remnants of previous formally patterned styles. His landscapes were fundamentally different from what they replaced. The well-known formal gardens of England, which were criticized by Alexander Pope and others from the 1710s. The open English style of parkland first spread across Britain and Ireland, and then across Europe, such as the garden à la Française being replaced by the French landscape garden. By this time, the word lawn in England had semantically shifted to describe a piece of a garden covered with grass and closely mown. Wealthy families in America during the late 18th century also began mimicking English landscaping styles. In 1780, the Shaker community began the first industrial production of high-quality grass seed in North America, and a number of seed companies and nurseries were founded in Philadelphia. The increased availability of these grasses meant they were in plentiful supply for parks and residential areas, not just livestock. Thomas Jefferson has long been given credit for being the first person to attempt an English-style lawn at his estate, Monticello, in 1806, but many others had tried to emulate English landscaping before he did. Over time, an increasing number of towns in New England began to emphasize grass spaces. Many scholars link this development to the Romantic and Transcendentalist movements of the 19th century. These green commons were also heavily associated with the success of the Revolutionary War and often became the homes of patriotic war memorials. After the Civil War ended in 1865, middle-class pursuit before the mechanical lawnmower, the upkeep of lawns was possible only for the extremely wealthy estates and manor houses of the aristocracy. Labor-intensive methods of scything and shearing the grass were required to maintain the lawn in its correct state, and most of the land in England was required for more functional agricultural purposes. This all changed with the invention of the lawnmower by Edwin Beard Budding in 1830. Budding had the idea for a lawnmower after seeing a machine in a local cloth mill which used a cutting cylinder mounted on a bench to trim the irregular nap from the surface of woolen cloth and give a smooth finish. Budding realized that a similar device could be used to cut grass if the mechanism was mounted in a wheeled frame to make the blades rotate close to the lawn's surface. His mower design was to be used primarily to cut the lawn on sports grounds and extensive gardens, as a superior alternative to the scythe, and he was granted a British patent on the 31st of August 1830. In an agreement between John Ferriby and Edwin Budding, Ferriby paid the costs of development and acquired rights to manufacture, sell and license other manufacturers in the production of lawn lawn mowers. Budding went into partnership with a local engineer, John Ferraby, and together they made mowers in a factory at Thrupp near Stroud. They allowed other companies to build copies of the mower under license. The most successful of these was Ransom's, Sims and Amp Jeffries of Ipswich, which began mower production as early as 1832. However, his model had two crucial drawbacks. It was immensely heavy and difficult to maneuver in the garden, and did not cut the grass very well. The blade would often spin above the grass uselessly. It took 10 more years and further innovations, including the advent of the Bessemer process for the production of the much lighter alloy steel, and advances in motorization such as the drive chain, for the lawnmower to become a practical proposition. Middle-class families across the country, in imitation of aristocratic landscape gardens, began to grow finely trimmed lawns in the back gardens. In the 1850s, Thomas Green of Leeds introduced a revolutionary mower design called the Silence Messer, which used a chain to transmit power from the rear roller to the cutting cylinder. The machine was much lighter and quieter than the gear-driven machines that preceded them, and won first prize at the first lawn mower trial at the London Horticultural Gardens. Thus began a great expansion in the lawn mower production in the 1860s. James Sumner of Lancashire patented the first steam-powered lawn mower in 1893. Around 1900, Ransom's automaton, available in chain or gear-driven models, dominated the British market. In 1902, Ransom's produced the first commercially available mower powered by an internal combustion gasoline engine. J.P. Engineering of Leicester, founded after World War I, invented the first riding mowers. This went hand in hand with a booming consumer market for lawns from the 1860s onward. With the increasing popularity of sports in the mid-Victorian period, the lawn mower was used to craft modern-style sporting ovals, playing fields, pitches and grass courts for the nascent sports of football, lawn bowls, lawn tennis and others. The rise of suburbanization in the interwar period was heavily influenced by the Garden City movement of Ebenezer Howard and the creation of the first garden suburbs at the turn of the 20th century. The garden suburb, developed through the efforts of social reformer Henrietta Barnett and her husband, exemplified the incorporation of the well-manicured lawn into suburban life. Suburbs dramatically increased in size. Harrow-Weald went from just 1,500 to over 10,000, while Pinner jumped from 300 to over 20,000. During the 1930s, over 4 million new suburban houses were built, and the suburban revolution had made England the most heavily suburbanized country in the world by a considerable margin. Lawns began to proliferate in America from the 1870s onwards. As more plants were introduced from Europe, lawns became smaller as they were filled with flower beds, perennials, sculptures, and water features. Eventually the wealthy began to move away from the cities into new suburban communities. In 1856, an architectural book was published to accompany the development of the new suburbia that placed importance on the availability of a grassy space for children to play on and a space to grow fruits and vegetables that further imbued the lawn with cultural importance. Lawns began making more appearances in development plans, magazine articles, and catalogs. The lawn became less associated with being a status symbol, instead giving way to a landscape aesthetic. Improvements in the lawn mower and water supply enabled the spread of lawn culture from the northeast to the south, where the grass grew more poorly. This, in combination with setback rules which required all homes to have a 30-foot gap between the structure and the sidewalk, meant that the lawn had found a specific place in suburbia, United States prior to European colonization. The grasses on the east coast of North America were mostly broom straw, wildberry, and marsh grass. As Europeans moved into the region, it was noted by colonists in New England, more than others, that the grasses of the New World were inferior to those of England and that the livestock seemed to receive less nutrition from it. In fact, once livestock brought overseas from Europe spread throughout the colonies, much of the native grasses of New England disappeared, and an inventory list from the 17th century noted supplies of clover and grass seed from England. New colonists were even urged by the country and companies to bring grass seed with them to North America. By the late 17th century, a new market in imported grass seed had begun in New England. Much of the new grasses brought by Europeans spread quickly and effectively, often ahead of the colonists. One such species, Bermuda grass, became the most important pasture grass for the southern colonies. Kentucky bluegrass is a grass native to Europe of the Middle East. It was likely carried to Midwestern United States in the early 1600s by French missionaries and spread via the waterways to the region around Kentucky. However, it may also have spread across the Appalachian Mountains after an introduction on the East Coast. Kentucky bluegrass is now one of the top 3 pasture grasses in the United States and the most desirable species of grass for lawns. Farmers at first continued to harvest meadows and marshes composed of indigenous grasses until they became overgrazed. These areas quickly fell to erosion and were overrun with less favorable plant life. Soon, farmers began to purposefully plant new species of grass in these areas, hoping to improve the quality and quantity of hay to provide for the livestock, as native species had a lower nutritive value, while Middle Eastern and European species of grass did extremely well on the east coast of North America. It was a number of grasses from the Mediterranean that dominated the western seaboard. As cultivated grasses became valued for the nutritional benefits to livestock, farmers relied less and less on natural meadows in the more colonized areas of the country. Eventually, even the grasses of the Great Plains were overrun with European species that were more durable to the grazing patterns of imported livestock. A pivotal factor in the spread of the lawn in America was the passage of legislation in 1938 of the 40-hour workweek. Until then, Americans had typically worked half-days on Saturdays, leaving little time to focus on the lawns. With this legislation and the housing boom following the Second World War, managed grass spaces became more commonplace. The creation in the early 20th century of country clubs and golf courses completed the rise of lawn culture. American lawn culture. Lawn monoculture was a reflection of more than an interest in offsetting depreciation. It propagated the homogeneity of the suburb itself. Although lawns had been a recognizable feature in English residences since the 19th century, a revolution in industrialization and monoculture of the lawn since the Second World War fundamentally changed the ecology of the lawn. Intensive suburbanization both concentrated and expanded the spread of lawn maintenance, which meant increased inputs in not only petrochemicals, fertilizers and pesticides, but also natural resources like water. Front lawns became standardized in the 1930s when, over time, specific aspects such as grass type and maintenance methods became popular. The lawn care industry boomed, but the Great Depression of the 1930s and in the period prior to World War II made it difficult to maintain the cultural standards that had become heavily associated with the lawn due to grass seed shortages in Europe, America's main supplier. Still, seed distributors such as Scott's Miracle-Gro Company in the United States encouraged families to continue to maintain the lawns, promoting it as a stress-relieving hobby. During the war itself, homeowners were asked to maintain the appearances of the home front, likely as a show of strength, morale, and solidarity. After World War II, the lawn aesthetic once again became a standard feature of North America, bouncing back from its minor decline in the decades before with a vengeance, particularly as a result of the housing and population boom post-war. The G.I. Bill in the United States let American ex-servicemen buy homes without providing a down payment, while the Federal Housing Administration offered lender inducements that aided the reduction of down payments for the average American from 30% to as little as 10%. These developments made owning your own home cheaper than renting, further enabling the spread of suburbia and its lawns. Levittown, New York was the beginning of the industrial suburb in the 20th century, and by proxy the industrial lawn. Between 1947 and 1951, Abraham Levitt and his sons built in more than 17,000 homes, each with its own lawn. Abraham Levitt wrote, "No single feature of a suburban residential community contributes as much to the charm and beauty of the individual home and the locality as well-kept lawns." Landscaping was one of the most important factors in Levittown's success, and no feature was more prominent than the lawn. The Levitts understood that landscaping could add to the appeal of the developments and claimed that increase in values are most often found in neighborhoods where lawns show as green carpets, and that, over the years, lawns, trees and shrubs become more valuable both aesthetically and monetarily. During 1948, the first spring that Levittown had enjoyed, Levitt and Sons fertilized and reseeded all of the lawns free of charge. The economic recession that began in 2008 has resulted in many communities worldwide to dig up the lawns and plant fruit and vegetable gardens. This has the potential to greatly change cultural values attached to the lawn, as they are increasingly viewed as environmentally and economically unviable in the modern context. Australia. The appearance of the lawn in Australia followed closely after its establishment in North America and parts of Europe. Lawn was established on the so-called nature strip by the 1920s and was common throughout the developing suburbs of Australia. This term is uniquely Australian, alluding, perhaps, to man's desire to control nature. By the 1950s, the Australian-designed Victor lawnmower was being used by the many people who had turned pastures into lawn and was also being exported to dozens of countries. Prior to the 1970s, all brush and native species were stripped from a development site and replaced with lawns that utilized imported plant species. Since the 1970s, there has been an interest in using indigenous species for lawns, especially considering the lower water requirements. Lawns are also established in garden areas as well as used for the surface of sporting fields. Over time, with consideration to the frequency of droughts in Australia, the movement towards naturalism, or the use of indigenous plant species in yards, was beneficial. These grasses were more drought-resistant than the European counterparts, and many who wished to keep the lawns switched to these alternatives or allowed the green carpets to revert to the indigenous scrub in an effort to reduce the strain on water supplies. However, lawns remain a popular surface, and the practical and aesthetically pleasing appearance reduces the use of water-impervious surfaces such as concrete. The growing use of rainwater storage tanks has improved the ability to maintain them. Following recent droughts, Australia has seen a change to predominantly warm-season turf grasses, particularly in the southern states like New South Wales and Victoria, which are predominantly temperate climates within urban regions. The more drought-tolerant grasses have been chosen by councils and homeowners for the choice of using less water compared to cool-season turf grasses like fescue and ryegrass. Mild dormancy seems to be of little concern when high-profile areas can be oversown for short periods, and nowadays, turf colour-ons are extremely popular. Within Australia, it is reported that there are nearly 400 turf farms. Knowing which farm is currently selling what turf variety is difficult. However, in 2016 an independent website called Turf Finder was developed to assist homeowners and professional turf managers in choosing the appropriate turf grass that meets the needs. The website lists generic and technical information on over 100 warm and cool season turf grasses and provides the location of reputable turf producers from across Australia that sell these turf varieties. Uses. Lawns are a common feature of private gardens, public landscapes and parks in many parts of the world. They are created for aesthetic pleasure, as well as for sports or other outdoor recreational use. Lawns are useful as a playing surface both because they mitigate erosion and dust generated by intensive foot traffic and because they provide a cushion for players in sports such as rugby, football, soccer, cricket, baseball, golf, tennis, hockey and lawn bocce. Lawns and the resulting lawn clipping waste can be used as an ingredient in making compost and is also viewed as fodder, used in the production of lawn clipping silage, which is fed to livestock as a sustainable feed source.